Police officers say something is seriously wrong in America, and the reason they know that is not because of the crime statistics. The crime rate is actually going down nationally. The reason they know is because of the last call of the night, the one that is not a crime, the one that does not make the blotter, the one where the officer walks into an apartment and finds a human being who is alive but has stopped living, sitting in the dark. No electricity, no food, no one who has called in weeks, and the officer sits down on the floor next to that person and stays for 40 minutes. Not because protocol requires it, because nobody else on earth was going to sit there. And when the officer gets back in the car, they do not cry. Not because they are tough, because they stopped being able to cry about 2 years ago. And that sentence, that the person who is supposed to protect you has lost the ability to feel what they are seeing, is the most terrifying thing I will say in this entire video. Entire police departments are disbanding across the country. A police chief in Minnesota resigned, and his entire force walked out behind him. New York City's force is at its lowest level this century. DC hit a 50-year low. LA is at 1990s. Staffing, over 70% of agencies say recruitment is harder than it has ever been. More officers die by suicide than in the line of duty. And the number one word counselors hear from law enforcement is not depression or anger. It is numbness. The same word 54% of Americans are using to describe their own lives. And the officers are finally talking, not through official channels, through podcasts, through anonymous posts, through conversations they were never supposed to have in public. And what they are saying is not about crime. It is about what they see in the faces of the people they are sworn to protect. The faces have changed. The eyes are different. The despair is everywhere. On every shift, in every zip code. And the officers are the first ones to see it because the radio does not lie. Entire police departments are disbanding across the country, and a police chief in Minnesota resigned, and his entire force walked out behind him, and a town of 1,300 people woke up with no law enforcement, and nobody on television covered it because the story is too uncomfortable to tell. In Goodhue, Minnesota, a town of 1,300 people, Police Chief Josh Smith went to the city council and told them what was happening. He told them his officers were underpaid. He told them the department could not fill vacancies. He told them that if the compensation and support did not improve, the department would collapse. And the city council listened and did nothing. And Chief Smith resigned, and his entire force resigned behind him. Every officer. And a town of 1,300 Americans woke up one morning with no police department, no patrol car, no badge, no 911 response that would arrive from within the city limits. And the residents were placed under the jurisdiction of the county sheriff's department, which was itself understaffed and responsible for hundreds of square miles of rural territory. And Goodhue was not an anomaly, it was a symptom. NBC News reported the story, but the national media treated it as a local curiosity rather than what it actually was, which is a warning that the institution of local policing in the United States is disintegrating from the bottom up. And American Police Beat magazine confirmed in May 2025 that in Morris, Minnesota and Washburn, Illinois, entire departments disbanded because they could not maintain minimum staffing levels. Disbanded, not reduced, not restructured, disbanded. The doors closed, the cars parked, the buildings went dark, and the communities that depended on those departments were left to fend for themselves. And the National Fraternal Order of Police President Patrick Hughes said the sentence that should have been a national headline. He said across the country, what you are seeing in Indianapolis is repeated in city after city after city, city after city after city, and Respond Capture's 2026 recruitment crisis report documented that over 70% of law enforcement agencies reported that recruitment has become more difficult compared to 5 years ago. 70%. And agencies across the country are operating at an average of 91% of their authorized staffing levels, which means there is a nearly 10% deficit in the workforce that is supposed to protect 330 million people. And that 10% deficit is not distributed evenly. It is concentrated in the cities and towns that need officers most. The places with the highest crime, the places with the most mental health calls, the places where the opioid crisis is hitting hardest, the places where homelessness is most visible. The places where the social fabric is fraying fastest. Those are the places losing officers the fastest, because those are the places where the job is the hardest and the pay is the lowest relative to the cost of living and the risk. And New York City's police force has fallen to its lowest level this century, despite pay increases. Washington, the 600th Metropolitan Police, hit a 50-year low in uniformed officers, despite offering 5-figure signing bonuses. Los Angeles police staffing has shrunk to 1990s levels. Baltimore has 1,981 officers instead of the needed 2,600. Despite hiring 75 officers in one period, 86 had already left. They hired 75 and lost 86. The net gain was -11. The department is shrinking while it is actively trying to grow, and the officers who remain are stretched to and beyond their limits, according to the National Policing Institute's 2026 trend analysis published on policeone.com. Beyond their limits. That is the language the policing establishment is using to describe the people who are still showing up. Not at their limits. Beyond them, and the phrase being repeated quietly in department hallways and patrol car conversations across the country, confirmed by the same analysis, is 6 words that should chill every American who depends on a 911 call being answered. The phrase is, "I am going as soon as I am eligible, as soon as I hit my pension, as soon as I qualify for retirement, as soon as I can leave without losing my benefits." The officers are counting down, not the days until their next shift, the days until they can stop. The calls that police officers are responding to in 26 are not the calls they were trained for, and every shift has become a mental health intervention and a homeless outreach visit and a drug overdose response and a welfare check on someone who has given up on life, and the officers are absorbing the despair of an entire country through a radio. A retired officer wrote anonymously on a law enforcement forum in early 2026 a sentence that has been shared thousands of times among active officers because it names the thing they all feel but cannot say on the record. He wrote, "We were trained to enforce laws, but what we are doing now is holding a society together that does not want to be held. Holding a society together that does not want to be held." And the National Policing Institute's 2026 analysis confirmed what that sentence describes. Officers are now expected to handle mental health crises, school security, addiction response, homelessness intervention, community mediation, domestic violence counseling, and proactive community policing, on top of the traditional duties of patrol, investigation, and enforcement. And they are expected to do all of it with fewer officers, smaller budgets, more public scrutiny, and less institutional support than at any point in modern American policing history. And the Performance Protocol Report from December 2024 said it plainly. Understaffing increases officer burnout, turnover, and response times while limiting crime prevention efforts. And the calls are not what they used to be. 20 years ago, the majority of police calls were criminal in nature: burglary, assault, theft, traffic stops, domestic disturbance. The calls had a structure, a suspect, a victim, a report, a resolution. The officer could process the call, file the paperwork, and move to the next one with the psychological distance that procedural work provides. The calls in 2026 are different. The calls in 2026 are a 911 from a neighbor who has not seen the elderly woman next door in 4 days, and when the officer arrives, the woman is sitting in a dark apartment with no electricity because she could not pay the bill, and no food because LIHEAP was cut, and she did not know who to call because her children live in another state and do not answer the phone. The officer cannot arrest anyone. There is no crime. There is only a human being who fell through every safety net the country was supposed to have, and the officer is the last institution standing between that person and a death that nobody will investigate because it will be classified as natural causes. And the calls are a welfare check on a 34-year-old veteran who has not shown up to work in 2 weeks, and when the officer arrives, the man is alive but has not left the couch in 9 days, and the apartment smells like something the officer recognizes from previous calls that did not end with the person alive, and the officer sits down and talks to the man for 40 minutes because there is no mental health team available, because the city defunded the mobile crisis unit in 2021 and never restored it. And the calls are a drug overdose in the parking lot of a gas station, where the officer administers Narcan all for the 3rd time this week to a person they have administered Narcan to before, and the person comes back and looks at the officer, and the look on their face is not gratitude. It is disappointment, because they did not want to come back. And the officer drives away and does not talk about it because talking about it means acknowledging that the job has become something they did not sign up for. And the State Line article from May 2026, titled "When the Helpers Feel Helpless," described the growing mental health crisis among first responders. When the helpers feel helpless, that title names the paradox. The people who are supposed to stabilize the crisis are destabilizing from the inside because the crisis they are absorbing is too large, too persistent, and too hopeless for any individual to carry. And 53.6% of active officers report experiencing burnout, according to the Respond Capture analysis. More than half burned out. Still putting on the uniform. Still answering the radio. Still driving to the call where the person in the apartment has not eaten in 3 days, and there is no crime to report, and no agency to call, and no solution that a badge can provide. The officers are not just responding to crime anymore. They are responding to the collapse of the American social contract, one call at a time. And every call leaves a residue that they carry home, and that their families absorb, and that their children sense, and that nobody treats, because the officer will not ask for help, because asking for help in a culture that valorizes toughness is an admission that the job has broken something inside you that you do not have the words to describe, and the job is breaking them. Not the danger, the despair. Police departments across the country are lowering their standards to fill empty patrol cars, and the agencies that used to require a college degree and 26 weeks of academy training are now accepting candidates they would have rejected 5 years ago because the alternative is having no officers at all. Stateline published an investigation in September 2025 that documented a trend so quiet and so dangerous that most Americans have no idea it is happening. Police agencies across the country are lowering education standards as staffing shortages persist. Lowering, not raising, not maintaining. Lowering, departments that used to require a 4-year college degree have dropped to a 2-year degree. Departments that required a 2-year degree have dropped to a high school diploma. Departments that required a diploma have dropped to a GED. And in some cases, agencies are accepting candidates with no post-secondary education at all, as long as they can pass a physical fitness test and a background check that has itself been relaxed to broaden the eligible pool. And the research that supported the education requirements was not ambiguous. Studies consistently found that officers with college degrees were less likely to use excessive force, performed better in complex situations requiring judgment and de-escalation, had fewer citizen complaints, and were more effective at community policing. The education requirement was not a bureaucratic hurdle. It was a quality filter that produced better outcomes for the communities those officers served, and the filter is being removed. Not because the research changed, because the applicant pool shrank, and the pipeline shrinkage is not limited to education. Academy training hours have been reduced in multiple jurisdictions. The national average for police academy training is approximately 21 weeks, which is already far shorter than comparable countries. Germany requires 2 to 4 years. Finland requires 3 years. Norway requires 3 years. The United Kingdom requires 2 years. The United States gives its officers approximately 5 months of training and then hands them a firearm, a badge, and the authority to use lethal force in situations that require the judgment of someone with years of experience. And some departments are now compressing that timeline further. Field training periods are being shortened because there are not enough field training officers to supervise the incoming recruits because the field training officers are leaving. And the recruits are being released to solo patrol earlier because the department needs bodies in cars to cover the shifts that the departed officers left uncovered. And the result is a force that is younger, less experienced, less educated, and less prepared, entering a policing environment that is more complex, more volatile, more emotionally demanding, and more heavily scrutinized than at any point in modern history. The calls are harder. The public is angrier. The mental health crises are more frequent. The drug overdoses are more lethal. The homelessness is more visible. And the officers arriving at those calls in 2026 have less training than the officers who arrived at simpler calls in 2016. The quality is declining at the exact moment the demand for quality is increasing. And the public does not know this is happening because the departments do not publicize it. They do not hold press conferences to announce that they dropped the college requirement. They do not issue statements explaining that the academy was shortened by 4 weeks. They quietly adjust the standards, fill the cars, and hope that the new recruits with fewer qualifications do not make the kind of mistake that ends up on body camera footage on the evening news. And some of them will, because the correlation between training hours and use of force incidents is well documented. Officers with more training use less force. Officers with less training use more. And the country that trains its police for 21 weeks while Finland trains for 3 years is about to discover what happens when you reduce even that minimal standard, because nobody wants the job anymore. The standard is the last guardrail, and the guardrail is being lowered. And behind the guardrail is a cliff. And behind the cliff is a lawsuit, a settlement, a viral video, a protest, and another wave of resignations that makes the staffing crisis worse, which makes the standards drop further, which makes the next incident more likely. The cycle feeds itself, and nobody in a position to break it is willing to spend the money required to break it, because the money is going to the war and the debt and the interest and the defense budget and the lobbying that maintains all of it. And the officers who remain are watching the new recruits arrive and thinking the same thought. These people are not ready for what they are about to see. More police officers die by suicide than in the line of duty, and the number one word that counselors hear from law enforcement is not depression or anger or fear. It is numbness. The same word the rest of the country is using to describe what is happening to them. The New York Times published a report confirming that police officers are more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty. Read that sentence again. The officer on patrol in your city tonight is statistically more likely to take their own life than to be killed by a suspect. At least 184 officers die by suicide each year, according to First Help, the nonprofit that tracks law enforcement suicide data nationally. And Blue Help documented 160 law enforcement suicides in 2022, 143 in 2021, 146 in 2020, and the peak of 256 in 2019. And the Science Direct Review found that depending on the study, the rate of police suicide ranges from twice the rate of line-of-duty deaths to 3 times the rate to 8 times the rate of the general population. 8 times. An occupation that was supposed to be populated by the most psychologically tested, most physically screened, most resilient segment of the workforce is killing itself at 8 times the national rate. And in one Texas sheriff's office that CNN profiled, 4 current and retired deputies died by suicide within 6 weeks of each other, 4 colleagues, 6 weeks, in the same building. And CNN's investigation revealed a detail that the policing establishment rarely acknowledges. 17% of the officers who died by suicide were in retirement. They had survived the career. They had served their years. They had reached the finish line. And then they died, because the trauma does not end when the uniform comes off. It follows you home the way a call follows you home. It sits in the chair next to you at dinner the way the image of the overdose victim sits behind your eyes when you close them. It wakes you at 3 a.m. the way the radio used to wake you. Except now there is no radio, and the call is coming from inside your own nervous system. And a counselor who works with law enforcement officers told The Trace in April 2026, the sentence that connects the police suicide crisis to every other crisis described in this video. She said, "The number one word I hear from law enforcement is not depression or anger. It is numbness. Numbness." The same word the woman in the video at the beginning of this series used to describe what everyday Americans are feeling. The same word the organizational psychologist Adam Grant used to define languishing. The same word that 54% of Americans report as the dominant emotional state of their lives. The officers are numb, the population is numb, the country is numb, and the officers are numb for the same reason the population is numb. They are absorbing a reality that exceeds the capacity of their nervous system to process. And the nervous system, when overwhelmed, does not break dramatically. It shuts down quietly. Emotion by emotion. Sensation by sensation, until the person is still functioning, still driving, still answering the radio, still going through the motions of a life that no longer registers as meaningful. And only 17% of officers sought help for PTSD. And only 7% sought any form of mental health treatment. Because the culture of policing treats vulnerability as weakness. Because asking for help risks your career. Because the department that needs you to be strong cannot afford to acknowledge that the job it gave you is destroying you. And the officers who do seek help discover that the therapist they are assigned has never worn a badge, has never sat in a patrol car at 2 a.m. in a neighborhood where gunshots are background noise, has never administered Narcan to a teenager and watched the disappointment on their face when they came back, and cannot understand the weight of carrying a society's despair through a radio 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 20 years. And so the officer stops going, and the numbness deepens. And the deepening numbness produces the statistic that should be painted on the wall of every police academy in the country. More officers die by their own hand than by the hand of the people they are protecting. And the country that is supposed to honor its officers does not talk about it, because talking about it means acknowledging that the job is killing them. And acknowledging that the job is killing them means acknowledging that the society they are policing is the thing doing the killing. The country told its officers they were the problem, and then the country called 911 because nobody else was coming, and now the officers are trapped between a population that resents them and a population that needs them. And both populations are the same people. In the summer of 2020, following the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, the largest sustained protest movement in American history swept through every major city and hundreds of smaller ones. The demands ranged from police reform to police defunding to police abolition. City councils voted to cut police budgets. Minneapolis pledged to dismantle its police department entirely. Los Angeles cut $150 million from the LAPD budget. New York cut $1 billion. Portland disbanded its gun violence reduction team. Seattle reduced its police budget and lost 300 officers within 18 months. And the message that the officers received, whether it was intended or not, was clear. You are the problem. Your institution is the disease. Your uniform is the symbol of oppression. Your presence is the threat. And the officers responded the way any human being responds when the community they serve tells them they are not wanted. They left. Resignations and retirements surged. Applications plummeted. The staffing crisis that had been building quietly for a decade exploded into a full-scale workforce emergency that the National Policing Institute now calls the defining challenge of modern American policing. And former Detroit Police Chief James Craig described the psychological mechanism in an interview that named the human dimension of the crisis. He said many officers resigned or retired after seeing police leadership fail to push back against mayors who supported the protests and budget cuts. The officers felt abandoned, not just by the public, but by their own chain of command. The people above them did not defend them. The people around them were leaving, and the people they were sworn to protect were calling them the enemy. And then the same cities that cut the budgets and lost the officers experienced the consequences. Response times increased. Proactive policing decreased. Visible patrol presence declined. And the communities that had demanded fewer police found themselves in neighborhoods where 911 calls went unanswered for hours, because the officers who used to cover those beats had transferred to suburban departments or retired early or simply quit. And the calls kept coming, because the people who said defund the police in 2020 are the same people calling 911 in 2026 when their car is broken into, when their child is missing, when the man outside the grocery store is screaming at someone who is not there, when the fentanyl overdose is happening in the bathroom of the gas station, when the domestic violence is escalating next door at 2 a.m. And the officer who answers that call, if an officer is available to answer it, arrives carrying the memory of being told they were the problem, carrying the knowledge that the city cut their colleagues, carrying the awareness that the training budget was reduced, carrying the weight of a society that both despises and depends on them simultaneously. And the Thin Blue Life analysis from January 2026 named this paradox with devastating clarity. It said officers are serving under constant suspicion, often in communities that no longer presume their goodwill. This reality corrodes the soul long before it shows up on a staffing report or organizational chart. Corrodes the soul. That is a policing publication using spiritual language to describe what is happening to officers because the clinical language is insufficient. Burnout does not capture it. Stress does not capture it. PTSD does not capture it. Corrosion of the soul captures it. Because the officer is not just physically exhausted, they are existentially wounded. They signed up to protect a community. The community told them they were the threat. And then the community called them at 2 a.m. because there was nobody else to call. And the officer went, because that is what officers do. They go, even when the community that called them is the same community that protested their existence 4 years ago. Even when the response time means they arrive alone because their backup is covering 3 other calls because half the department left. Even when the call is another welfare check on another person who has fallen through every other net that the society was supposed to have, and the officer is the last one standing between that person and the abyss, they go. And then they go home. And they do not sleep. And they do not talk about it. And they do not ask for help. And the numbness deepens, and the cycle continues. And the country that told its officers they were the problem has discovered that the officers were actually the last functioning thread in a social safety net that has otherwise disintegrated. And the thread is fraying, and nobody knows how to repair it, because repairing it requires something that the country has run out of. Trust. Officers who have been on the force for 15 or 20 years are saying publicly and privately that the American population has changed at a biological level, and the people they are encountering on calls in 2026 are not the same people they were encountering in 2010, and they cannot explain why. The nurse in the video at the beginning of this series said it with the bluntness that comes from seeing it every day. She said people are different since that respiratory virus back in 2020. They are different. People are not the same. And then she said the sentence that police officers across the country are saying in private conversations that never make the official reports. She said, I am not exactly sure what happened. If it is PTSD, if they did not get enough oxygen to their brain, but people are just not the same. And officers with 15 and 20 years on the job are confirming this observation from the other side of the same crisis. They are not diagnosing it. They do not have the clinical vocabulary, but they are describing it. And what they are describing is a population-level behavioral shift that manifests on every type of call, in every demographic, in every neighborhood, across every income level. The aggression threshold has dropped. Incidents that would have been verbal disputes in 2015 become physical altercations in 2026. Road rage that would have involved honking and yelling now involves firearms. Retail theft that used to involve concealment and escape now involves open defiance, with shoplifters walking past security without running because the social inhibition that used to prevent that behavior has weakened. Domestic calls that used to de-escalate with officer presence now escalate despite officer presence because the emotional regulation capacity of the people involved has deteriorated. And the mental health calls have not just increased in volume, they have changed in character. The people officers encountered during psychiatric emergencies are presenting with a flatness, a detachment, a vacancy that veterans on the force say they did not see before 2020. The eyes are different, the responses are delayed, the emotional range is compressed. It is as if the person behind the face has partially withdrawn, and what remains is a shell that is technically functioning but not fully present. And the neuroscience supports what the officers are observing. Chronic stress, social isolation, sleep disruption, dopamine dysregulation, financial anxiety, and sustained cortisol elevation produce measurable changes in brain structure and function. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control, empathy, and decision-making, shows reduced activity under chronic stress. The amygdala, which processes threat detection, becomes hyperactive, causing people to perceive neutral situations as dangerous. The hippocampus, which processes memory and context, shrinks under sustained cortisol exposure, reducing the brain's ability to distinguish between past trauma and present reality. And 90% of Americans say the country is in a mental health crisis, and 54% report feeling isolated, and 264,000 die of despair every year. And the officers are the ones who interact with this population, not through surveys or studies, but through 911 calls at 2 a.m. in apartments and parking lots, and intersections and gas stations, where the consequences of the population-level psychological damage are not abstract. They are a person standing on a bridge, a person pointing a weapon at themselves, a person screaming at a wall, a person who has not eaten in 4 days, a person who has stopped speaking entirely. And the officer who arrives has 21 weeks of training, a depleted department behind them, no mental health team available, a body camera recording everything, and approximately 6 minutes to resolve a situation that is the product of 5 years of compounding societal breakdown. And the veteran officers, the ones who remember what the calls looked like in 2010, know that something fundamental has shifted. They cannot name it. They do not have the data, but they see it. Every shift in the eyes of the people they are sworn to protect. And the eyes are different now. Empty, further away, harder to reach, and the officers are carrying the weight of that observation without anyone asking them what they see, because nobody asks the officers what they see. The country asks them what they did. And the gap between those two questions is the space where the officers are quietly breaking. The job is consuming the officers' families, and the divorce rate for law enforcement is among the highest of any profession, and the children of police officers are growing up with a parent whose body comes home every night, but whose mind stopped coming home years ago. A study published in the Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology found that law enforcement officers experience divorce rates significantly higher than the general population, with estimates ranging from 60 to 75%, depending on the department and the methodology. 75%. 3 out of 4 marriages involving a police officer end in divorce. And the reason is not the hours, although the hours are brutal. 12-hour shifts, rotating schedules that change every month, weekends that are work days, holidays spent in a patrol car instead of at the table. The reason is not the danger, although the danger is real. The reason is what the officer brings home that they cannot leave at the station. The images, the smells, the sounds, the face of the child in the car seat at the accident scene. The weight of the notification to the family whose son is not coming home. The Narcan administration that did not work this time. The welfare check where they arrived too late. The veteran who looked at them with disappointment because they saved a life that did not want to be saved. And the officer cannot talk about it because talking about it means reliving it, and reliving it means feeling it, and feeling it means acknowledging that the job has changed something inside them that was not changed before. And so they do not talk. They sit at the dinner table, and their spouse asks how their day was, and they say fine, the same word that 54% of Americans use to describe a state that is not fine. And the spouse knows it is not fine. They can see it. The way the officer stares at the middle distance during conversations. The way they flinch at sounds that used to be background noise. The way they check the exits when they walk into a restaurant. The way they sleep with one eye open or do not sleep at all. The way they stopped laughing at the things that used to make them laugh. The way the phone calls at 3 a.m. produce a sigh instead of an adrenaline response because the adrenaline system that used to activate has been burned out by overuse, and the children see it too. The children of police officers grow up in homes where one parent is physically present but emotionally unavailable, where dad or mom is sitting on the couch but is not really there, where the bedtime story is read in a voice that is mechanically correct but emotionally absent, where the Little League game is attended by a parent who is scanning the parking lot instead of watching the pitch. And the research on secondary trauma documents that the families of first responders absorb the trauma through proximity. The spouse who hears the fragments of the stories, who sees the nightmares, who endures the mood swings, who navigates the emotional withdrawal, develops their own symptoms of PTSD. And the children who grow up in homes with a traumatized parent are more likely to develop anxiety, depression, behavioral issues, and attachment disorders. And the officer who is losing their marriage and missing their child's childhood and watching their family fracture under the weight of a job that nobody outside the profession understands is simultaneously being told by the department that they need to be resilient, by the public that they need to be accountable, and by the politicians that they need to do more with less. And the officer sits in the patrol car after the shift and does not drive home immediately. They sit in the parking lot of the station for 10 or 15 minutes, not checking the phone, not listening to the radio, just sitting. Because the transition from officer to parent, from badge to human, requires a decompression that no department provides and no training teaches and no policy acknowledges. And then they drive home, and the spouse asks how the day was, and the officer says fine. And the marriage moves one day closer to the 75%, and the child moves one day further from the parent who used to be present before the job consumed the person they married. And nobody counts these casualties because they do not appear in the line of duty death statistics. The marriage that ended is not a fallen officer. The child who grew up without a parent who was emotionally present is not a line of duty injury. But the damage is real, and the damage is cumulative. And the damage is the hidden cost of a profession that absorbs the country's despair and carries it home in a body that cannot put it down. Officers are breaking the code of silence, not about corruption, about what they see in the population. And they are going on podcasts and writing anonymous posts and telling anyone who will listen that something is seriously wrong and nobody at the top is acknowledging it. There has always been a code in law enforcement. You do not talk about the job outside the job. You do not discuss calls with civilians. You do not share what you see on your shift with your family, your friends, your community. The code was originally about operational security and legal liability. You do not compromise an investigation by talking about it in public. But the code evolved over decades into something broader and more damaging. It became a silence about everything, about the mental health crisis, about the suicide rate, about the burnout, about the things officers see that nobody else sees, about the population-level behavioral changes that are visible from a patrol car but invisible from a desk, and that code is breaking. Not through official channels, not through department press conferences or union statements or congressional testimony, through podcasts, through Reddit threads, through anonymous posts on law enforcement forums, through YouTube comments, through conversations that happen off the record, off camera, off duty, and increasingly on the record, on camera, and in uniform. And what the officers are saying is not about crime statistics. It is not about policy. It is not about politics. It is about the human landscape of the country they patrol. They are saying the calls have changed. The eyes of the people have changed. The frequency of despair has changed. The number of children in crisis has changed. The number of elderly people found alone has changed. The number of people who say they do not want to be alive has changed. And the official numbers do not capture it, because the official numbers count crimes. They do not count the welfare check where the person is alive but has given up. They do not count the domestic call where nobody pressed charges but everybody in the house is suffering. They do not count the traffic stop where the driver burst into tears for no reason related to the stop. They do not count the officer who sat in a stranger's living room for 40 minutes because there was nobody else to sit there and the person needed someone to listen. Those interactions do not generate a statistic, they generate a scar, and the scars accumulate, and the officers who have accumulated enough of them are starting to talk, because the weight of carrying the observation alone has become heavier than the consequence of breaking the code. And what they are describing in podcast after podcast and post after post is a country that is coming apart at the human level. Not at the political level, not at the economic level, at the level of the individual human being who is standing in their kitchen at midnight, trying to decide whether tomorrow is worth showing up for. And the officers see that person because the officers are the ones who arrive when the person decides it is not. And the pattern that the officers are describing does not match any official narrative about the country. The GDP says the economy is growing. The officers are responding to more calls involving people who cannot pay their rent. The unemployment rate says 4.3%. The officers are encountering more people sleeping in their cars. The Consumer Confidence Index says one thing. The look on the faces at 3 a.m. welfare checks says something entirely different. And the officers are done pretending that the official version of reality matches the version they see through the windshield of a patrol car at 2 in the morning. And the code of silence was designed to protect the institution. But the institution is at 91% staffing and 7% confidence and 53.6% burnout. And a suicide rate that exceeds the line of duty death rate. The institution is not being protected by the silence. It is being suffocated by it. And the officers who are breaking the code are not doing it for attention. They are doing it because somebody needs to say what they are seeing before the thing they are seeing becomes the thing nobody can fix. And the thing they are seeing is a country where the despair is no longer exceptional. It is ambient. It is everywhere. It is in every zip code. It is on every shift. It is in the eyes of the 34-year-old veteran, and the 72-year-old widow, and the 16-year-old who says they do not want to be here anymore. And the officers are the witnesses. They are the first responders to a national emergency that nobody has declared. And they are saying as loudly as the code will let them, something is seriously wrong. And they are right. Police officers are not just witnesses to the collapse. They are the canary in the coal mine. And when the canary stops singing, the miners do not argue about whether the canary was right. They get out of the mine. Coal miners used to carry a canary into the shaft because the bird's respiratory system was more sensitive to toxic gases than the human body. When the air became poisonous, the canary stopped singing and died before the miners felt the first symptom. And the miners did not debate whether the canary was being dramatic. They did not commission a study on whether the canary's death was statistically significant. They did not form a committee to investigate whether the canary had pre-existing conditions. They got out of the mine, because the canary's death was the data, and police officers are the canary. They are inside the mine shaft of American society 8 to 12 hours a day, 5 to 6 days a week, year after year, breathing in the toxic atmosphere that the rest of the population only encounters in fragments. You encounter the despair when you scroll past a headline. The officer encounters it when they walk into the apartment. You encounter the addiction crisis when you read a statistic. The officer encounters it when they hold the Narcan against the nostril and wait for the breath. You encounter the homelessness when you drive past the tent on the overpass. The officer encounters it when they wake the person inside the tent at 5 a.m. because the city received a complaint and someone has to move them along to the next overpass where the same interaction will happen tomorrow. The officers are inside the mine, and the canary is dying. 184 suicides per year, 53.6% burnout, 75% divorce, staffing at 91% and falling, entire departments disbanding, education standards being lowered, training hours being cut, veterans counting the days until their pension, recruits arriving unprepared for what they are about to absorb, and the people outside the mine, the public, the politicians, the media, the commentators, are watching the canary die and debating whether policing needs reform or funding or abolition, as if the canary's death is a policy question. It is not a policy question. It is a warning. The canary is not dying because it was a bad canary. The canary is dying because the air is poisonous, and the air is not poisonous inside the police department. The air is poisonous inside the country. The officers are absorbing a society that is running on 23.79% credit card interest and $4.55 gas and $18.19 trillion in consumer debt and 264,000 deaths of despair and 165 million lonely people and 45% of households that cannot make ends meet and 90% who say it is a mental health crisis and a government at 7% confidence that is spending $1 billion a day on a war that has closed the strait for over 100 days. The officers are absorbing all of that. Through the radio, through the call, through the eyes of the person standing on the bridge at 3 a.m., who is not committing a crime but is telling the officer something about the state of the country that no GDP number will ever capture. And the officers are the ones who hear it first, before the economists, before the politicians, before the think tanks, before the media. The officers hear it first because the radio is the most honest feedback loop in the country. It does not lie. It does not spin. It does not adjust the methodology. The radio says what happened. And what is happening right now, on every radio, in every patrol car, in every city and county and town across the United States, is the sound of a country that is breaking down at the human level. And the officers have been trying to tell you, through their departures, through their suicides, through their burnout, through their broken marriages, through the code of silence they are finally breaking. They have been trying to tell you, the air inside the mine is poisonous, and the canary is dying. And the question is not whether the canary is right. The canary is always right. The question is whether you are going to listen before the air reaches you. Because it will. The only difference between the officer and you is that the officer breathes it in concentrated form every shift. You breathe it in diluted form every day. The same gas, the same toxicity, the same despair, the same numbness, the same loss of interest in everything. The same weight on your chest that sleep does not fix. The same fog that the woman in the video described. The officers feel it at 200 proof, you feel it at 20, but it is the same substance, and the canary is dying from it, and you are next, unless you listen. What the officers are telling you through every resignation, every suicide, every broken marriage, and every broken code of silence, is that the country does not need more police. It needs more of the thing that would make most police calls unnecessary, and that thing has never worn a badge. I want to end this video by saying something that no policing channel will say, and no defund movement will say, because both sides of the argument are trapped inside the same false binary. One side says we need more police, the other side says we need fewer police. And neither side is asking the question that the officers themselves, the ones who answer the radio every night, are asking in the quiet moments between calls when nobody is recording and nobody is watching. The question is, why are there so many calls? Not how do we respond to the calls faster? Not how do we fund more officers to handle the calls? Not how do we reform the way the calls are handled? Why are there so many calls? And the answer, which the officers know intuitively and the data confirms structurally, is that the calls are not caused by a lack of policing. They are caused by a lack of everything else. The mental health call exists because the community mental health center was defunded in the 1980s and never replaced. The overdose call exists because the addiction treatment system is underfunded, overwhelmed, and inaccessible to the people who need it most. The domestic violence call exists because the stress of financial despair is breaking families apart, and the 23.79% credit card interest, and the $4.55 gas, and the insurance renewal, and the grocery bill are producing a pressure that the human nervous system was not designed to absorb. The welfare check exists because the elderly person lives alone, because their children moved away, because the jobs moved away, because the factory closed, because the production was offshored, because the trade deal was written by the same political class that has 7% confidence. The homeless call exists because the median home requires $110,000 in income, and the median income is $59,000, and the gap between those numbers is a tent under an overpass and an officer with a clipboard telling the person inside the tent to move. Every call the officer answers is the downstream consequence of a system that failed upstream, and the officer is standing at the bottom of the river, pulling drowning people out one at a time, and nobody is walking upstream to see who is pushing them in. And the thing that would make most police calls unnecessary is not a policy, it is not a program, it is not a budget line item, it is community. It is the neighbor who notices that the elderly woman has not been outside in 4 days and knocks on her door before the situation becomes a 911 call. It is the friend who recognizes that the veteran is withdrawing and sits with him before the withdrawal becomes a welfare check. It is the family that shares a meal with the person who is alone, before the loneliness becomes a crisis that an officer responds to at midnight. It is the block that organizes, that knows each other's names, that checks on each other, that shares tools and food and conversation and presence so that the isolation never deepens to the point where a badge is required to address it. The officers are not telling you they need more backup. They are telling you they need you to be the backup. Every meal you cook for a neighbor is a call that never gets dispatched. Every knock on a door is a welfare check that never requires a patrol car. Every conversation with a struggling friend is a crisis intervention that never reaches the radio. Every act of community is a subtraction from the volume of human despair that is currently being routed through a 911 system that was designed for emergencies and is now being used as the last remaining connection point between a broken population and a functioning institution. And the institution is breaking under the weight. The officers have told you, through their departures, through their suicides, through their silence and their broken silence, through the 53.6% who are burned out, and the 75% whose marriages failed, and the 184 who died by their own hand, and the 70% of departments that say it is harder now than it has ever been. They have told you something is seriously wrong. And the something that is wrong is not the crime rate. The crime rate is actually declining nationally. The something that is wrong is the loneliness rate, the despair rate, the hopelessness rate, the giving up rate, the staring at the ceiling at midnight rate. Those rates are climbing. And the officers are the ones who see the climb first, because the climb becomes a call, and the call becomes their shift, and the shift becomes their life, and the life becomes the 184. And the answer is not more officers. The answer is fewer reasons to call. And fewer reasons to call starts with you. Knowing your neighbor's name, checking on the person you have not seen, sitting with the person who is struggling, being the community that the system dismantled, and the algorithm replaced, and the suburbs designed away, and the economy atomized. Be the thing that makes the call unnecessary. Because the officers cannot carry this alone. They have been carrying it, and it is killing them. And the thing they want you to know, the thing they are saying through every broken code, and every anonymous post, and every resignation letter, and every funeral for a colleague who died not in the line of duty but by their own hand, is this: we cannot save a country that will not save itself. And saving itself starts with the simplest act in the world.